How many All-Star games will Ja Morant make over the course of his hopefully illustrious career? What about Jaren Jackson Jr., the two Grizzlies All-Stars of this past weekend? Will Jaren appear in another game or two? And what about Desmond Bane or anybody else on the Memphis Grizzlies roster? Who else has a shot to crack the All-Star code for the Memphis Grizzlies? We're going to talk about that here on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, once again flying solo, the co-host to Michael Cole, continuing to pay attention and focus in on family at this time. Again, when DeMichael comes back, I will be extremely excited, but it also will be on his time. We continue to wish him and the Cole family well during this difficult time. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. We are here at Locked On Grizzlies, proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can rate, review, subscribe, all of those wonderful things. You can also check us out on YouTube. Thank you so much to everybody that continues to make our YouTube page a success. It's growing, and that's a great thing. So we appreciate it here on Locked On Grizzlies. I appreciate it, and I know I can speak for DeMichael on that count as well. Thank you 1,000 times. We are happy that you're with us on this episode and every episode moving forward as we head forward in the NBA season. Now, on this episode, before I jump back in to looking at the Western Conference and make predictions for the Grizzlies schedule and all those sorts of things, I'm still sitting on an all-star question, something that's been batting around in the bumblings and rumblings of my mind for the entire day. And I'm hopeful that you can help me kind of work through this mental exercise. Maybe in the comments, you can hit me up. Let me know what you think of my responses to these questions, because I believe it was our good friend Dime Dropper who stopped by and talked to us about Luke Nuke Kennard over on the trade deadline, around the trade deadline, over on Locked On Clippers. He said that he felt that Jaren Jackson Jr. would not make another All-Star game. And looking back on this All-Star team and saying, wow, look, Jaren Jackson Jr. made an All-Star game. That's amazing, right? That's crazy. And that got me to thinking, how many All-Star games will the two guys that represented the Memphis Grizzlies in this most recent All-Star game, Ja Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., log? And is there anybody else on the Grizzlies, one answer obvious later on in the show, that could potentially break through and be a part of the festivities, not just on an All-Star Saturday night or in a Rising Stars Challenge, but the actual main event game itself? And I probably should put air quotes around main event because, as I talked about on yesterday's show, not the best game in terms of basketball being played, but it is a spectacle. It's cool to see all that talent assembled. So it's going to continue to be a thing. I'm going to start with Ja Morant, because Ja Morant is the one that has already started 2 All-Star games, been selected to 2 All-Star games. And he's a guy that when you think the future of the NBA, most folks at this stage slide to Ja Morant, right? He's got the Nike shoe deal, advertisements. He's electric. Kids love Ja Morant, extremely talented player. Even my daughters, Caroline and Abby, know Ja Morant. They know who that is. They are fans of his. He kind of transcends, right? So let's start with Ja. And I think for this exercise, instead of, crowdsourcing over-unders, that sort of thing, although FanDuel certainly would be helpful with that, I figured that since we compare so often the new Grizzlies big three of Morant, Bane, and Jackson, spoiler alert on the last one, since we compare those three to the Warriors big three of Curry, Thompson, and Draymond Green so often, all of those guys have been selected to All-Star games. So we're going to use that as the template, or the amount of All-Star games that they have made to this point, understanding that Steph Curry will probably make another All-Star game or two. Klay Thompson and Draymond Green might be done. So the number as of now for those three guys, that's where we're going to set it at in terms of the Grizzlies the Grizzlies big three. And will they get over the hump of that number? So for Steph Curry, the number is 9. He is a 9-time All-Star, which is extremely impressive, right? It makes what LeBron James does at 19-time All-Star all the more impressive as well. But we're going to set it at that. Will Ja Morant make 9 All-Star games? And he's already got 2, right? So that means he has to make 7 more over the course of his career. He's 23 years old. And I think the easy answer to this one is yes, right? That he will make more than 9 All-Star games. Not necessarily because he's better than Steph Curry, but just because he has achieved at a young age a level of stardom that is going to enable him to be a consistent piece of the All-Star puzzle for years to come, assuming health. Really, the only thing that can kind of derail him on this path, on this road at this point, is his health. As long as he is healthy, as long as he is in a position to compete in these games, he is going to be a selection. Will he always be voted in? Probably not, right? Steph Curry has a couple more years left, you'd imagine. Luka Doncic is there as a guard until the position settings and the position aspects of the All-Star game are established or changed, excuse me. Then you're probably looking at Ja Morant being a reserve more often than not. Steph Curry and Luka Doncic are just better than Ja Morant at this point. I know this is Locked On Grizzlies, but I try to be a little bit objective. Steph Curry will cool eventually. Maybe Ja surpasses him next year, a couple years from now, but it ain't right now. So even if he's not a starter, we're not talking about how many times is he going to start. We're talking about how many times is he going to represent the Memphis Grizzlies in the All-Star game. If Steph is at 9, and again, you assume maybe 1 or 2 more for Steph, but we're going with the current number of 9. Ja's going to go over that. Ja's 23. You could argue Ja's going to go over that by the time he's 30 or 31 years old, assuming health. Ja Morant's health has been the biggest question for him to this point of his career. But the good news on that front is this season he's been relatively healthy, right? I think he's missed maybe 8 or 9 games to this point. So again, if he's playing 70 or so games every season, he's going to be an all-star every time he goes out there and he's selected. Jaren Jackson Jr. was an all-star this season. We'll talk more about him here in a moment. And he was selected as an all-star after only playing in 40 games so far this season. So as long as Ja is in that ballpark, he is going to be selected. He has to be healthy around this time of year in order to keep that energy going. And he also needs to continue to evolve his game. And that is something that's going to continue to be a focus of not just me, but to Michael and everybody else that follows the Memphis Grizzlies. The three-point shot, continuing to develop that. The free throw shooting that Ja Morant continues to have issues with. That's a problem, especially for someone that's going to draw as many fouls as Ja Morant does. So Ja being in a position to surpass Curry at that number, again, doesn't necessarily mean that Curry is worse than Ja. But it does mean that Ja Morant is at the level of Curry in terms of stardom, or at least he can be. I don't know if Ja Morant is hosting any miniature golf shows anytime soon. But I do think that in terms of, again, the pop-up store at Salt Lake City that by all accounts was extremely successful for his new Nike line of clothing and, of course, the Ja 1 shoe that DeMichael has talked so much about on this show and over at the Commercial Appeal, the universal appeal of him in terms of being a small-town kid that made good, found his way to the league, another mid-major superstar like Damian Lillard, who we talked about on yesterday's show. Ja Morant has the capacity to be that next dude, to be the Allen Iverson in terms of basketball cultural impact of this generation. That's on the table for him. And with that comes popularity, and with that comes all-star selections. So if he's not selected as a starter because Steph and Luka are there, he's almost certainly going to be a reserve. And then it's hard to imagine this, but a day is coming. We're closer to it than we are further away from it, that Steph Curry is going to be out of the NBA. And when that happens, it's going to be Ja Morant and Luka Doncic that are the two guys holding it down in those guard spots, again, assuming that there is no change in that structure to how the All-Stars are selected. I hope they expand the rosters. You know, the rosters are 15 for NBA games, right? So why wouldn't they be 15 for the All-Star game? If I was a player going into these collective bargaining agreement debates, that would be something I'd argue for. That adds 6 All-Stars, that adds greater acknowledgement of success, that allows for players to put that in contract negotiations. I think expanding the All-Star roster makes a ton of sense. And then we're certainly going to see Ja and maybe the next couple of guys that we're going to talk about in that mix. So Steph Curry currently has 9. Again, obviously Steph Curry and Ja Morant are very different basketball players. We're using those two as a comparison for the purpose of here is what Ja and Steph are aligned to in terms of the build of the Grizzlies franchise compared to the Warriors one. Next, here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to talk about the guy that made his All-Star debut on Sunday. It wasn't much of a debut, only 8 or so minutes, but he got in the game. He did some things. How many All-Star games for Jaren Jackson Jr.? And we'll compare him to Draymond Green next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Big fan of FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download the FanDuel app, America's #1 sportsbook. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back. If your first bet doesn't win, download the FanDuel Sports app. Safe, secure, super easy to use. Then you can bet on anything from the money line to point scores, threes drained, all those sorts of things, from the spread to money line, player props like points, rebounds, assists. Or if you're feeling extra frisky, you could do some exclusive bets like the 2x3. That's 2 3-pointers scored in the first 3 minutes of play. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine bets for a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Will Jaren Jackson Jr. make it back to the All-Star game? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, formerly of GrizzlyBearBlues.com, now a writer for SB Nation NBA and Fansided over at my Substack, Written in the Dark. Thank you all so much for checking out all of those different sources of content. And of course, my main focus being here with Locked On Grizzlies each and every day as a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Earlier, we talked about Ja Morant and how I see him passing 9. Now, again, Steph Curry might get 10 or 11, depending on how long Steph plays. I think that Ja can pass that even. If he gets to 9, he's 30 years old. So assuming health, which with Ja, maybe he misses 1 or 2. He does fall a little funny. He gets to the basket a lot. I think that's surpassable for Ja. The next one I'm not as sure about, and that's Jaren Jackson Jr. Because when I saw, and I knew this because I followed the NBA for a long time, but Draymond Green has made 4 All-Star games. 4, count them, 4 All-Star games, which is just phenomenal to me that he has made that many All-Star games. Obviously, there are reasons for that. One, he's really freaking good, right? Draymond Green, a likely Hall of Famer. He also plays at Golden State, which is the most popular franchise in the NBA. So in terms of fan votes and that sort of thing, he always gets attention in that way. He's on national television a lot. But again, that's not to disregard how good Draymond is. And I like the Draymond to Jaren comparisons because they both are not just Michigan State Spartans, but they both are defensive first players, right? The prior comparison between Steph and Ja was not perfect. Steph Curry is the greatest shooter of all time. Ja Morant, not the greatest shooter of all time. He might become one of the greatest finishers of all time or one of the greatest, guards scoring in the paint of all time, but he's not going to be the 3-point shooter that Steph Curry is. Their style of play is different. While Jaren and Draymond get to the point of being defensive impact players in different ways, at least they both impact the game in a similar fashion defensively, if that makes sense. The ends justify the means, so to speak. The ends are the same. The means are different. Jaren, obviously, a block monster leading the league in stocks. Draymond, much more methodical, much more switchable, just really a cerebral player. Not to say that Jaren isn't, but Jaren is capable of physically dominating a game, whereas Draymond is capable of mentally dominating it. And obviously, both of those factors help when it comes to being an elite defender. They both play with great effort. That's a major piece of it, too. Draymond has made 4 All-Star games. And again, this is Locked On Grizzlies. I'm supposed to be a bit of a homer, but I also have to maintain some semblance of fairness. I don't think Jaren makes it to 4. I really don't. And that is disappointing to say, and that's something that you are probably going to disagree with. Let me know in the comments. Hit me up on Twitter at Joe Mullinax, all those sorts of things. Let me know what you think. I think Jaren gets to 3. I think Jaren will get a couple more. I don't see him hitting 4, and here's why. The Western Conference is going to continue to add forward talent, right? Like there's a decent chance that Wemby from over in France winds up in the Western Conference. and he's eventually going to be a superstar in the All-Star game all the time. Sabonis isn't going anywhere. A lot of the bigs in the West are not necessarily going away. Now, obviously, you have Paul George that'll eventually age out. LeBron James, of course, will eventually age out. So that'll cancel out a bit. But I'm not convinced that Jaren is going to have the path as a star to get to the All-Star game. His selection in this game was controversial. Not to me and you. You and I, we watched Jaren Jackson Jr. play. We know how dominant he can be. We know how he's the best two-way player on the Memphis Grizzlies. All those things are true. And we are well aware that Jaren Jackson Jr. deserved and earned his selection to the 2023 All-Star game. But not everybody else is as aware of that. You got to remember Anthony Davis didn't get selected, missed a lot of games. You got to remember that there were other names that were in that mix that were not a part of that process to be All-Stars. So the path is not as clear for Jaren, and I think that he will be bothered by the existence of Ja Morant. It is not common for All-Stars to have, or for teams to have multiple All-Stars. Really good teams usually have multiple All-Stars, and maybe that is the caveat here. Maybe that is the thing that I should pump the brakes a bit on, because the Grizzlies are structured to be pretty good for the next 4 to 5 years at least. Depending on how long they keep Ja, Bane, and Jackson Jr. together, it could be longer than that. If they prioritize those three guys, and if Robert Pera is to be believed and he's willing to go into the luxury tax, they could keep them forever in theory. Or not forever, but you understand my point. They could keep them the rest of their careers, and that's, the next 10 plus years, over a decade of these three being together in Memphis. How cool would that be, right? That's possible. That's on the table. And as long as those three guys are healthy and on the floor together, the Grizzlies are going to be a playoff team. They're probably going to be a top 10 team in the NBA. They've proven it for a large enough sample size to this point before their primes to say that that is possible. So maybe you make that argument, right? The Sacramento Kings, after injury replacements, had 2 All-Stars in De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. Maybe you make that argument that Jaren could be that second guy enough to get past Draymond's 4. I just don't see it. I don't know that, Draymond Green, even earlier in his career when he was getting those All-Star nods, he was being given the benefit of the doubt for the greatness of the Warriors. He was being given the attention that comes, again, with being on the national stage so consistently. The Grizzlies have a ton of national games compared to their history, but they're not the Golden State Warriors. They're not going to have that market size. They're not going to have that level of fan base. They're just not. It'd be awesome if they did. It'd be cool if our numbers here on Locked On Grizzlies were 2 times, 3 times, 4 times what they are consistently. That doesn't mean I'm not grateful for you. I just want to make that clear. I'm very grateful for you. Yes, you listening, you watching. Hey, you're special to me. But the Warriors fan base is just bigger. It's just larger. It's just grander in scale. However you want to say it. There's just more people. There's just more people. That's not the truth for the Grizzlies. So Jaren would have to take a pretty substantial leap offensively, which he's capable of doing. We see it. Again, you see it. You watch him create mismatches almost every offensive possession. He has that capacity. But is he going to be able to do it on a consistent basis to earn that opportunity to be that type of player on a night in, night out basis that gets those multiple All-Star selections without the benefit of the market that Golden State provides? Is Jaren Jackson Jr. ceiling higher than Draymond Green's? 100%. It's not even a question in that regard. Jaren Jackson Jr. has a far more extensive offensive skill set than Draymond Green. Draymond is a wonderful big passer, maybe one of the best in the history of the NBA. Domantas Sabonis' dad might disagree with that. Marc Gasol, Joakim Noah. Those guys were amazing passers too. But Draymond's pretty elite in that area. No disputing that. He's much better at it than Jaren. That skill set's almost non-existent for Jaren Jackson Jr. at this stage of his career. But as a creator off the dribble, in terms of getting to the rim, he just has a higher ceiling because of his size, his frame. He has a better frame in terms of defense. His ceiling is higher. The best compliment that I can pay Draymond Green is he gets the absolute most out of the squeeze when he goes for the juice. He has gotten every ounce of ability out of the talent and size that he's been given. And not very many people can say that. If Jaren Jackson Jr. does the same thing that Draymond Green did, he's going to have a better career and he's going to be a better player than Draymond ever was. But because of circumstances outside of Jaren's control, being next to Ja Morant, playing in a smaller market, I could see Jaren maybe getting a couple more All-Stars. I don't think Draymond's making any more. I don't know that Jaren passes 4. I don't see it. Is there anybody else on this Grizzlies team that can be in that conversation for an all-star appearance? There's an obvious name that obviously we'll discuss, but beyond that, is there anyone else? Or is that another realization of the current state of things for the Memphis Grizzlies? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Do not go anywhere. Stay right there. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, joining you for the final bit of our conversation today, talking about the Memphis Grizzlies and their all-star prospects. We missed DeMichael Cole, my co-host. He will hopefully be back here in the next few episodes, but he can take as long as he wants. We're thinking of him and his family, continuing to shout out to DeMichael. We miss you, buddy. The show rolls on for us, for you and I. And we talked about Ja Morant, and I'm taking the over on Steph Curry's 9 current All-Star games. Again, Steph might make more than that. We talked about Jaren Jackson Jr., and I'm taking the under when compared to Draymond Green. And again, I want to remind you, because there might be some Warriors fans listening to this. I'm not saying that Ja Morant and Steph Curry are on the same plane, because they're not. Steph Curry is better than Ja Morant right now. Draymond Green, obviously, has had a more illustrious career to this point than Jaren Jackson Jr. Doesn't mean Jaren can't surpass him in terms of play. Like I mentioned, he is just physically better than Draymond Green. But Draymond has realized that potential. Again, every juice possible has come out of the squeeze of the whatever fruit that you like to juice for Draymond. Jaren's not there yet. Doesn't mean it can't be. The next logical comparison, if we're comparing the dynastic 3 of Steph, Klay, and Draymond, Klay Thompson, and of course for the Grizzlies filling that role, is Desmond Bane. Klay Thompson, surprisingly, has only made 5 All-Star games. And I say only. I thought he would have made more, because when you think star power, when you think that guy that can go off, go viral on social media because of an amazing offensive performance, it's Klay Thompson, right? So the fact that he's only made 1 more All-Star game is mildly surprising. Now, you have to keep in mind he suffered injuries for a couple of seasons there where he wasn't able to participate. It probably would have been a little bit higher. Desmond Bane's not sniffing that, I don't think. I don't think Desmond Bane's getting to the 5, even though he is the next in line potentially to be the type of shooter that Klay Thompson and Steph Curry are. Again, Warriors fans, not saying that he's going to be better than those two. You could argue that Steph Curry, obviously the greatest shooter of all time. Klay Thompson might be the second best. And they played together. That's phenomenal when you think about it. The history of that will be something that'll be fascinating to study one of these days when they're all done. And, you know, in the next few years, that's probably true. But will Bane even make an All-Star game? That is the level that I want to take this conversation to. And it ties us into the overall scope. And it'll be a wonderful segue into tomorrow's episode, because I feel personally that Desmond Bane will be worthy of all-star status. And he had a lot of all-star type performances earlier in the season when the Grizzlies needed him to be that guy because Jaren Jackson Jr. wasn't there. Their defense was struggling. They had to outscore opponents. Desmond Bane was there. And he was willing to be that guy. But if he does make it, it'll be at the expense almost certainly of a Jaren Jackson Jr. because those two guys, it's extremely difficult for 3 dudes from the same team to make it. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's extremely unlikely. This isn't the Atlanta Hawks where they had 4 All-Stars all those years ago, right? With Al Horford and Paul Millsap and Kyle Korver. You know, those guys. That's not happening again, I don't think. Seems unlikely. The Grizzlies could potentially be that level of team if they put the right pieces around them moving forward. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But those 3, Ja, Jaren, and Bane, Ja is the clear one. And again, in a market like Memphis, if you get that one, to get a second is going to be difficult moving forward. And it worked out this year. Again, the fact that Jaren was selected before injury replacements was shocking in a good way. Because again, he deserves it. He deserved that recognition. But there were other guys that could have deserved it too. So for Memphis to have 2 All-Stars is tremendous. To have 3? Unlikely. And if Bane goes, that means one of Ja or Jaren wasn't able to, more than likely, for injury purposes, especially Ja. And that obviously would negatively impact the Memphis Grizzlies, which you certainly don't want to happen to the team. Can Bane make 1 All-Star game? Yes. And I think it's probable that he will. Because again, maybe Jaren doesn't get the recognition he's supposed to, but Bane has a red-hot first 40 or so games of the season. And he gets the acknowledgement for what he's capable of as an offensive player, and he gets that selection. I think that is not necessarily probable, but it's certainly possible. I would not bet against Bane making at least 1 All-Star game. But for the purposes of this exercise, Steph, Klay, Draymond, if we're comparing Bane to Thompson, is Bane getting 5? No, he's not. So that's a testament to what the war, or at least in my opinion, he's not. The key context here is all these guys are still young, right? Ja Morant, 23, Jaren Jackson Jr., 23, Desmond Bane, 24. The Warriors guys are all well past their 30s, and they are a few years removed, or away, I should say, from retirement. That'll clear up some space. So Bane will probably make 1, maybe even make 2. Is he getting to 5? Unlikely. And that realization that you've got a few-time All-Star potentially in the future in Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr. maybe getting to around 3 or 4 himself. Ja Morant's going to be the annual mainstay at this All-Star game. Maybe they can convince him to eventually do the dunk contest. But here's where things get a little bit heavy, dear listener, dear viewer. Who after that's making an All-Star game for the Memphis Grizzlies? Who? You tell me. Steven Adams? Nah. Dylan Brooks? Nope. Tyus Jones? Nope. Brandon Clark? Probably not. Again, maybe something happens to Jaren and Brandon goes off. It's possible. He has an explosive skill set. Luke Kennard? No. Those are guys that, especially Kennard, maybe he makes a 3-point contest again. Maybe Brandon Clark decides he'll do a dunk contest someday. What about the young Grizzlies? Zaire Williams? As high as I am on Zaire, and I think that Zaire will become a really strong role player in this league, I'm not willing to give up on him just yet. Zaire Williams is almost certainly not going to be an All-Star. Almost certainly. Doesn't mean he's had a bad career. Doesn't mean that he shouldn't, feel good about himself or should quit playing or, he won't even have a long NBA stay. I think those things will happen, especially the last one. I think that'll happen for him, hopefully in Memphis. But he's not going to be an All-Star. Jake LaRavia, David Roddy, have you seen anything from those guys that would suggest All-Star? Santi Aldama? Probably not. So those are all guys that are key reserves, key core pieces for this Grizzlies team. And it matters in terms of a trade potentially because, as it has been reported here, there, and everywhere, the Grizzlies were fairly aggressive at the trade deadline. Just takes 2 to tango. Didn't have a partner to do the dance of the devil with in the pale moonlight. They didn't have someone agree to a Kevin Durant trade. They didn't have someone agree to a Mikal Bridges trade or an OG and an Obi trade, who, by the way, not All-Stars this past year. So even for players of that ilk who are fringe All-Star type talents, Mikal Bridges looks like he might make that leap now that he's in Brooklyn. The Golden State Warriors had Andrew Wiggins, who had been named to All-Star games. Andre Iguodala, who obviously before his great run with the Warriors was an NBA All-Star. The Warriors were able to go out and acquire that talent. The Grizzlies got 3 All-Star level players. They don't have much below that. My dear New Zealand listeners and viewers, I'm not saying Steven Adams is bad. He has proven how valuable he is by how the Grizzlies have played while he's been out. And we'll talk more about how hopefully, the Grizzlies will be practicing on Wednesday, getting ready to go to Philadelphia on Thursday. Hopefully there's good news on the Steven Adams front and he's able to play against Joel Embiid on Thursday. If not, it's going to be a long night because Embiid's going to dominate whoever he's playing against almost certainly. Even Jaren Jackson Jr., who in terms of post defense, not really able, and in fairness, not really many folks are able to hang with Joel Embiid. So they need Steven Adams. Dillon Brooks is important for the culture of the team. We've talked about that here, there, and everywhere. But we're talking all-star talent. Ja Morant, clearly an all-star talent. Jaren Jackson Jr., clearly an all-star talent. Desmond Bane, not been named there yet, clearly an all-star talent. Those are their three for the Memphis Grizzlies. That is the core moving forward. But what else is there? For the Grizzlies to truly take that leap, do they have another guy that has that potential to do that sort of thing? That's why they were so aggressive at the trade deadline. For anybody not named Ja, Bane, or Jaren to be involved. They get that fourth guy, they're legitimate NBA Finals contenders. Maybe they get to the Western Conference Finals now, but if they're staring down the Phoenix Suns, if they're staring down the Denver Nuggets, if they're staring down the Clippers, you got Memphis in that series? We can talk more about that tomorrow on Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Now make your second listen game to game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result, Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. On our next episode, very excited to be turning back to meaningful basketball. No offense to the All-Star game, but the Grizzlies looking down a schedule. We're going to break down that schedule. We're going to talk about predictions, best case, worst case scenarios, what Memphis needs to do to hold on to the 2 seed. It's going to be an in-depth breakdown of the second half of the Grizzlies season tomorrow here on Locked On Grizzlies. You don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for listening, for watching. Rate, review, subscribe, like, comment, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. I am so grateful and appreciative to be a part of this network, the Locked On Podcast Network, to be partners with DeMichael here on Locked On Grizzlies. I look forward to seeing you, or having you, back with me tomorrow. Until then, stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. I'm Joe Mullinax, and this is Locked On Grizzlies.